Welcome to today's webinar, Supply Chain Disruptions and Food Waste. In just a minute, I'm going to hand things over to today's moderator, but first I want to give you a couple of quick updates. This event is presented by ReFED. As many of you know, ReFED is a national nonprofit working to end food loss and waste across the US food system by advancing data-driven solutions. Our vision, like yours, I'm sure, is a sustainable, inclusive, and resilient food system that makes the best use of the food that we grow. Last year, we introduced two free resources that are available on our website, the ReFED Insights Engine and the Roadmap to 2030, both of which were created to help support the food system's efforts to cut food waste by 50% by the year 2030. And what we try and do with events like this is to pull all of the data and solutions that are detailed in those resources off the page and bring them to life through the lived experiences of our panelists. To that end, I want to let you know about two upcoming webinars that I think you'll be interested in. We'll put a link in the chat box where you can register for both of them. Next week on March 30, we're excited to present a special webinar called Unlocking Impact Through Blended Finance Solutions. Blended finance is a way for funders with different types of capital and different investment objectives to work together to finance projects, and it's been used increasingly over the last few years to mobilize capital to help achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We've got some great speakers who will explore how blended finance works and how it can help advance and scale food waste solutions. This webinar is open to everyone to attend, and it's hosted by the Food Waste Funder Circle, which was launched by ReFED and Upcycled Food Association to provide private, public, and philanthropic funders interested in using their capital to solve food waste challenges with a curated platform for education, collaboration, and investment. We'll put a link in the chat box to get more information about joining the Funder Circle. And then the following week, we'll be hosting a fireside chat between our Executive Director, Dana Gunders, and Emily Ma, who is head of food for good, who's head of food for good at Google, as well as a ReFED board member. Google recently announced two new pledges to reduce food loss and waste throughout their global operations by 2025. And as part of that announcement, we're also thankful that they committed $1 million in anchor funding for the upcoming ReFED Catalytic Grant Fund. So on April 7, Dana will be chatting with Emily about Google's sustainability work, the need for innovation in the food waste space, and more. We'll put a link to get additional information about the upcoming ReFED Catalytic Grant Fund in the chat. And again, please use the events link in the chat to sign up for both of these webinars if you haven't already. And finally, I want to remind everyone that the countdown continues for the 2022 Food Waste Solutions Summit presented by ReFED, which takes place May 10 through 12 in Minneapolis. And if you are not able to join us in person, you can now do it virtually. That's right, for the first time ever, we are offering virtual tickets to help make sure that all of the insights, innovation, and action offered by the summit is available to as many people as possible. With a virtual ticket, you can live stream all main stage sessions, as well as get early access to recordings of all breakout sessions. And what's more, you'll also get full access to the event app, where you can see and contact all event attendees, can network, interact with all virtual exhibits, submit live questions for the live stream events, and participate in discussion boards. So be sure to check out the link in the chat box to see how you can register for a virtual ticket to the summit. Okay, now I want to introduce the moderator for today's session, Dana Gunders, who is the Executive Director of ReFED. Hello, Dana. We have been trying to schedule this webinar for a while now, and once we actually did, you got an interesting email.
I did. Hello, everyone. Yes, it was funny. We were going back and forth on this. And as we were doing that, my kids' school sent out a note. They said they've been informed that there was last-minute menu changes due to supply chain issues. And unfortunately, this will continue to be the norm going forward. Now, my kids, fortunately, are pretty good eaters, so it wasn't a problem for us, but just, just one of those real world examples. And then over the weekend, we were somewhere that had, don't judge, a lot of French fries and a lot of chicken nuggets and all. And hamburgers at this like barbecue station, and huge signs all over the place saying no ketchup, we ran out. So just kind of fascinating little sprinkles of this everywhere. I mean, how many times have you been to the grocery store and seeing empty shelves or something? And would love to invite you all to take a moment, if you've had any experiences like that, to throw them in the chat. We'd love to hear them and kind of bring them into the conversation as we can. Perhaps the most highly publicized food product to be missing from store shelves over the last couple of years is grape nuts, which face supply chain constraints brought by labor shortages and the pandemic. But ports in LA and Long Beach here in California, they together account for over 40% of all imported goods entering the country. They are just buckling from increased consumer demand and imported products of all types, not just food. One of our employees actually was trying to get a green card that was delayed for 5 weeks because they couldn't get paper. There was a paper shortage, in fact. So it's really happening all over the place. Ships are waiting in line for weeks to be able to dock. That adds shipping costs that then get passed down the chain. So it's really everywhere. And it's not just about products getting into the country through our ports, but getting from one point to another within the country has been challenged as well. Just last week, the New York Times ran an article about how difficult it is to be a truck driver now, including the long hours and long wages and persistent fatigue. That's affecting the reliability of their deliveries. So a lot factoring into this. And I have to admit that I've listened to podcast after podcast, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around exactly what is happening and why it continues. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. And of course, there's everything that has been until now, and then there's this whole new wrench called the war in Ukraine that, of course, is having yet another impact on supply chains, in addition to the direct impacts it's having for the people suffering from it. But Ukraine and Russia actually are almost a third of the world's wheat production and exports. And they have not been able to, export that product since all of this began, which is causing wheat prices then to spike and have record highs. So all of this is going on. Food is still being grown. It's still being produced. Cows are still producing milk, right? So what does it mean when we look at our food supply and what is happening in terms of how much it is going to waste? That's what we're here to talk about today. And we have some fantastic panelists to join us. We are welcomed first by Linda Dunn. She's the faculty director and assistant professor of the practice for Masters in Supply Chain Management at Georgetown University. She brings over 15 years of industry supply chain experience, spanning planning, sourcing, distribution, and supplier relationship management, and also served as the vice president of supply chain and quality assurance for HMS Host, which, if you don't know, serves almost all the food in airports around the country, in addition to other places. And in 2020, she received the Women in Supply Chain Award from Supply and Demand Chain Executive Magazine. So welcome, Linda. Great to have you. We also have Eric Woods. He serves as a corporate officer, VP of Field Operations at Sysco. He has over 15 years of leadership experience in supply chain, warehouse distribution, and related functional areas within the transportation field. And in addition to Sysco, his professional experience includes stints at companies like PepsiCo and Waste Management. And in addition to all of that, we are super lucky and proud to be able to call Eric a ReFED board member as well. So welcome, Eric. Thank you for being here. And last but not least, we are joined by Dana Yost. He is the Director of Produce Sourcing at the Community Food Bank in Southern Arizona. He oversees daily operations of the food bank's produce rescue and repack facility in Nogales, Arizona. And I'll let Dana tell you a little bit more about why Nogales is particularly interesting for this topic. But he works with the team. He's rescued record amounts of produce, more than 100 million pounds over the last 3 years. And he's one of the founding members of the Southwest Produce Cooperative. His past experience includes time with St. Mary's Food Bank Alliance, the Arizona Game and Fish Department, and the Humane Society of Southern Arizona. Thank you so much for being here, Dana. All right, so to get us kicked off, Linda, I'd like to start with you, and just by discussing the current strengths and weaknesses of the current supply chain as it relates to food. We know the war in Ukraine has been a big wrench, but maybe you could just start us even before that on like, what is happening in our supply chains? What are the challenges, and how specifically are they affecting food?
Sure, Dana. Thank you for inviting me here today, and it's a great topic. The pandemic really just exposed how complex, specialized, interconnected really the supply chain is. And really that supply chain risk management took a back seat as people really focused on cost efficiency, because everything was kind of stable, right? Low prices for gas, inflation low, it took a back seat. But the pandemic's really reshaped, I'd say, our supply chains. And when I look specifically at the food supply chain, I'd say what it did was really create this imbalance. We had swings both on the demand side and on the supply side. And if you look at demand, I'd say it's in 3 areas. One is just, it shifted to different sectors in the food world, right, in the industry. It went from food service having lower demand to retail having higher demand, and they couldn't necessarily shift at the same time. A great example of that is eggs. So breaker eggs or liquid eggs are used mainly in restaurants and food service, not so much on the retail. Those are the shell eggs, and yet you had this imbalance, right? Too many breaker eggs, not enough shell eggs. FDA stepped in, approved that certain things that were meant in the shell eggs could go to supermarkets. They did that on a temporary basis because there's different inspections and there's different labeling that happened in these sectors. And that's sort of that specialization. Second, we saw shift in the food demanded, right? As people stayed at home, cereal went up and things like seafood got hurt. So it's naturally going to be, if you're at home, you're going to eat different foods than if you're eating out. So this impacted many things and impacted packaging as well, frankly, if you look at aluminum and things like that. More and more people need the cans if you don't have the fountain drinks, right? You can look at it all across the spectrum and see that also happening. Then you have shift in geography when you look at demand. So the restaurants and workplaces that are right downtown that relied on breakfast and lunch got hurt. Right, but maybe in the suburban areas, the takeout was great at night for lunches. So you, again, all these imbalances in demand that are hard to react to very quickly in the supply chain as it's been set up. And then when you look at just the swings on the supply side, you've got, first of all, tons of workforce issues. I'd say you had acute issues when you had COVID lockdowns, when you had outbreaks, things like that. A plant got hit. Certain parts of the country hit at different times. So that was one way. And then we have ongoing issues like the trucker shortage, warehouse and production shortages as people left the workforce, great resignation, different things like that. And then you also had just port issues. And you mentioned that, Dana. I would say when I look at, and you talked about this a little bit, just exporting, we had a container issue, right? The containers were coming in from China, but they would go back empty because they wanted to quickly turn it around. So unfortunately for our agricultural industry, they weren't able to get their products shipped off. And so that actually was sort of the driving force for the Ocean Shipping Reform Act that's in the Senate now, and it passed the House, it's in the Senate. It's to really level the playing field to make sure our people can export as well their food. And it was really based on a lot of things that happened to the agricultural section. For example, I remember reading in one magazine, someone was providing pork. Fresh pork is really sought after in China, but because of waiting so long, they had to freeze it. And that decreases the amount they can get for it. They had to take a hit on it. So things like that happened because we couldn't get our product shipped off as well. And then there's just issues like in the port crisis, lack of chassis, lack of truckers, different issues that were happening. I'd also say the fertilizer crisis, I put it in a crisis, is occurring. And we're going to see more and more of the impact from that just based on, high natural gas prices. People don't produce it's needed to produce many of the fertilizers. And then, of course, China banning some exports of phosphorus and other fertilizers hurt us as well. So you've got all these things going on. Packaging is just a whole nother thing. When you talked about the ketchup not being available, I wonder, I have a friend in the industry and we were talking about, can't get your little cups for the ketchup and condiments, all your condiment cups. So it might not be the actual product. It could be the packaging. That's what you hear as much. So I'm not sure in that case, but it might be. So I would just say all of these things, if you look at them, it's not one thing. So you can't just fix one thing, right? And they're all interplay. They have domino effects and sometimes even effects you wouldn't consider that might happen. So like the souffle cups, right? Maybe lots of tomatoes, not enough souffle cups.
Wow, so much in there. It's just like overwhelming, honestly. Thank you so much for laying that out. And it's just fascinating. I think so much of it comes down to those details of like the little cup or that, there's so many logistics, right? And details to it all. Eric, turning to you. So you are on the ground. I'm sure you're feeling those trucker shortages and other pain points around this. So what raises to the top in terms of what you're seeing really causing potential disruptions? And I know you've mentioned to me before, in some places, Sysco is doing okay, but maybe smaller companies are having some challenges because they didn't think ahead in the same way. So I'd love to hear about that. And then specifically, are you seeing any waste that is happening because of that?
Yeah, I would tell you, and I think Linda hit on broadly everything that's affecting the industry. Probably the two things that are affecting the industry most are availability in terms of what products are available, right? So we went through chicken shortage, as you see companies start to advertise thighs instead of wings and those sorts of things. But then the employee shortage was probably the most dramatic, and not only in our business, but our customers. So restaurants, we saw them modifying their schedules. So when you think about food waste, right, they're used to one ordering pattern, but now whether it's COVID that shuts them down, they have to modify hours because of lack of availability. It starts to affect their ability to order consistently. So we've seen a lot of that whiplash. The industry started adjusting, and along comes the next wave. Omicron was the latest wave that then, with business was recovering pretty well, starting to get pretty steady, it impacted it again in the early January, February timeframe. We're starting to see a recovery again as we look and see what may be coming, from Europe and Asia. So, it's really that whiplash effect. It's, for our business, just because of our size, we were able to secure supply. But make no mistake about it, restaurants had to modify their menus just based on what's available. And even more broadly than that, because we service other segments, it's healthcare, where they can't modify based on dietary restrictions. So you have to find substitutes that are suitable for those customers. So it's, I think from the word go, everything that Linda mentioned, what's imported, the effect, probably the two largest effects have to do with employees, people within the restaurants, within our business, in addition to the supply, how steady that supply is. And it hasn't been one item, right? It's moved from ketchup, chicken wings into the next item than it was, with the storms that happened in Texas a year ago. It affected takeout containers. That was critically important because restaurants pivoted to takeout containers. So it's been a pretty dynamic change. I've been very impressed how resilient the industry has been. But to your point, there are hidden waste points in there every time that the industry has to pivot.
Yeah, so when those restaurants are kind of changing their orders last minute and canceling, I imagine that would leave you guys stuck with that supply that you secured. And then in
It
some
does.
cases, if it's highly perishable, it does wind up going to waste because what else, what are you gonna do?
No, it absolutely does. And then again, that's kind of the whiplash effect. For a large company, we're more easily able to move around supply and forecast. For small companies, it becomes waste, right? There's just nowhere to go. The cost to move it is greater than the cost to dispose of it. So that's one of the challenges. We can definitely see the market reshaping itself in terms of where market share is heading between what would have been your small mom and pops and what are other large suppliers, just because that's what a reshaping of an industry causes over time. So it's definitely, and it's not over. That's that's the reality. The trucker shortage is one of the things we talked about. We've been able to address it. There's an 80,000 trucker shortage. In the U.S., it's predicted to go to 160,000. We've opened driver schools that help address that for us. But the reality is we can't move goods in the restaurants, at the level that they need. And if you're a smaller company, you do have to make compromises on what you're going to sell, right? So that becomes one of the challenges in the industry more broadly.
Fascinating. So interesting. Great, thank you. Dana, turning to you for a moment. You are based in Nogales, Arizona, and I hope you'll take a moment to give us the statistics on just how big an entry point that is. It's a border town where a lot of produce enters the US. And I'm just curious, are you what are you seeing happening there now? How is it affecting the work at your food bank, at the larger network that's working with produce? And how are you adjusting?
Yeah, good morning, Dana. Thank you, and thanks to everyone for being on the call today. So I'm Dana Yost. I am the Director of Produce Sourcing with Community Food Bank of Southern Arizona. I'm actually based in Nogales, Arizona, one of the two primary ports for produce industry or produce imports into the U.S. In Nogales, we bring about 6 billion pounds of produce across the border every year. The other primary port for produce coming into the U.S. from Mexico is in McAllen, Texas. They're around 7 billion pounds a year. It's a tremendous piece of North American produce. About 70% during the winter months of the produce that we eat in the U.S. is coming out of Mexico. So we run a produce rescue operation in Nogales. Last year, we brought in about 42 million pounds. We're basically a business solution for our donors. We provide an alternative for them putting the product that they're not able to sell in the landfill. It costs them about $1,000 to put a load in the landfill. And so we provide that service to pick up produce that would otherwise go to waste that's perfectly edible. And we ship that all over the country. Last year, we shipped to 37 food banks in 30 states. And so we have a very large produce rescue operation. We also started a repack operation where we take bulk produce and we repack that into about a 20 to 25 pound box of 4 to 5 different kind of produce items. It's one of the things that we experienced from sort of a people supply chain standpoint in the food bank industry. Is when the pandemic hit, we basically lost our volunteer base. And volunteers are used to package up food, build boxes of commodities and whatnot. We lost that. We survived for more than a year on National Guard troops helping to do that work. But one of the big problems that we had in moving produce out that we rescued was no food bank in the country really had a volunteer base able to handle bagging that up into smaller quantities. And you can't really hand somebody a 40-pound box of squash, right? So we started repacking that probably about 18 months ago, and we've built more than 1 million boxes that we distributed nationwide of those. But the biggest thing that we're seeing right now is impacts from the trucking industry. And without a doubt, this is not a new issue. This is my 12th year in food banking. For at least 10 of those years, we've been talking about a driver shortage. I remember when I first came into food banking, we were talking about a 50,000 driver shortage. And, like Eric said, it's 80+ thousand now. it's definitely impacting the amount of food waste that we're seeing in Nogales. I got on a website this morning and looked at sort of the reefer demand that's out there right now, and for every driver available in the U.S. right now, the average is about 12 reefer loads sitting out there to be moved. And you know, that really gets exacerbated in Nogales because we're coming into our really, really busy time of the year. In April, historically, it's not unusual to see 30 plus loads sitting there for every available driver. And when that happens, you get product backed up all the way into Mexico. The majority of the product that comes into the Nogales port of entry comes on consignment, probably 70% of that. It is coming across the border regardless of US market conditions, regardless of whether there's a sale for that. It's all coming on spec. And there's fresh product crossing every single day. So the product that's sitting here in the coolers, as it's sitting there aging, it's going to get bumped from product that's fresher and coming across the border. And that's where we come into play, because a lot of that ends up sitting there because of the unavailability of trucks. And so we'll pick up those loads. The thing that gives us a little bit of an advantage for our operation, we've probably spent the last decade building a regional network of owned transportation through our partnership with other food banks, especially in the Southwest, into California, Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma. We partner with other food banks that have owned transportation, and we sort of just do drop-in hooks where we'll take a trailer, for example, to the Las Cruces, New Mexico, drop it there. Somebody from El Paso will come pick that up and take it further into Texas. And so we sort of use this network of owned transportation assets that we sort of partner together to get stuff moved. Because if we were relying on the trucking industry right now to move everything for us, it would not only cost a fortune, but it would be pretty much impossible to get loads moved for us. So I think that's the biggest impact and the biggest advantage that we have right now. But it's certainly a scary future that we're sitting out there looking at, because we just don't know how much worse it's going to get for us.
Yeah, sounds like we need the National Guard to come to go attend Eric's trucking school and then start driving around.
They drove for us for a little while. We had a couple of National Guard drivers that were delivering food for us for about a year. So without that, quite frankly, we would not have been able to keep doing what we're doing, and it really helped get us through really tough times.
Wow. So the volume of produce coming into the country that you're seeing is actually not changing that much. It sounds like that is not that delayed. It's really once it gets to the US that the delay is happening. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the one thing that I would say is that I think that a lot of the growers in Mexico are starting to, take a look at some of the pain that they've had and trying to make some adjustments. But we really haven't seen, any kind of a drop off. It's, growers in Mexico are like growers in the US. It's crop yield is very much depending on weather conditions, on all of the kind of other variables that farmers have to deal with. And quite often we're looking at excess crops. The only thing that really has impacted the Mexican supply chain into the US over the last couple of years is weather issues. A couple of years ago, we had some really bad Pacific hurricanes that moved across Mexico, and that did have an impact, and it certainly caused some shortages and some price spikes and whatnot. But, the last, 15 months or so, we've saw really good weather in Mexico, and really haven't seen a drop off in any of the amount coming across. We're sort of in the middle of this tomato glut right now, because tomato prices across the country have really flattened out and have really declined. And last week we were getting calls from donors with 20 truckloads of tomatoes to donate. I think we have more than 100 truckloads of tomatoes that got donated last week, which is a lot to move. 100 truckloads. I was
going to ask, are you able to make use of all that?
Yeah, they were all in really good shape. And, I was calling my contact list late into the night to try to move loads of tomatoes. And luckily we were able to do that. We didn't strand any of those loads. We were actually able to get those out to where, they had a home and they were able to get distributed. But, it's certainly a rough time when you get that kind of volume. And the reality is that if we are sitting here in the middle to do that, and we have counterparts that are doing the same exact thing in McAllen and across the country, if we're not here doing that work, that product is definitely going in the landfill.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I am glad that you are there doing that work then. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, clearly challenges. I'm hearing trucking a lot, employees, inconsistent demand, inconsistent supply availability. What are you all seeing? This question for all of you, so anyone jump in terms of success stories, like how are people trying to make the system more resilient, more flexible, and adapt to the situation now? I'm sure nobody wants to be throwing that food out or even sending 20 truckloads to donation. So are you seeing, any kind of bright spots of ways people are adapting?
I would tell you one of the things I see, and not my company specifically. I'm traveling. I'm actually in Denver. Is restaurants. You see the QR codes. They're adapting their menus behind the scene. So now they're able to supply what is available. So that's, if you start noticing and look on the tables, you will see a lot more QR code menus. And that's part of the reason behind that. So I think that's one of the ways to adapting. I think you've seen some of the commercials, like with, the chicken wing places, they're selling thighs because thighs are what's available, right? So I think those are, things that organizations are doing. And then I think, Linda talked about how might we, have regulations that allow us to send supply into non-traditional outlets for that particular type of supply, right? So how do I send, I think the eggs was a great example of, not sending non-shelled eggs into grocery store isn't something that is more typical, but having enough foresight to see that there's an oversupply. I think those are different ways that we've seen, society in total adapt.
I'd jump in and agree with what Eric said. I think a lot of companies, the short-term fix was more inventory on hand, just because it was so unpredictable. And that's particularly for those who are more just-in-time lean, right? They've got their safety stock and have been a little more careful. We saw that. But also you see companies taking more control of their supply chain in certain areas. So a Costco buying more warehouses where they're going to run it, or people buying their own ships in the case of not as much for food, but Lowe's and things like that. So people are taking a little more control, and they're also looking for better visibility and partnering on information. Where is something in the supply chain? So I think you're seeing people really get their dashboards cleaned up and looking at that, and also just taking more control overall.
The biggest thing for my industry, I think, is this idea of having a distributable unit that we can give out to the public. And we saw during the pandemic, there were several government commodity programs, sort of relief programs that the USDA sponsored with private industry to put a dairy box together, or a protein box together, or a produce box together. And that's what we started doing. We started building this, this 20-pound box of protein, produce where you can, food banks can just distribute directly to a client. And I think that that's a trend for the future. I'm actually involved in a couple of fairly significant pilot programs with other food banks. One of them with the folks in Texas that are piloting, developing what they're calling ag hubs to build these boxes, to build a produce box, to build a protein box, to build a dairy box. And I think, our industry, the food banking industry, is looking to transform into something that's more efficient. There were horror stories out there for food banks during the pandemic. We probably got down to about 3 weeks worth of food at my food bank at the very start of the pandemic, when nobody could go into a grocery store and find anything. We were seeing people that wouldn't even, ever need to go to a food bank having to come to us because they couldn't buy food in the grocery store. They might have had money to buy food, but they couldn't buy it because nothing was there. And so our backstock got really low, but there were other food banks. For example, the food bank in El Pasoans Fighting Hunger, they literally were down to about 5 days of food at one point, and we started shipping every bit of produce that we possibly had to them so that they could still have something to distribute. And I think, we've learned a lot of lessons, and I think the outcome of that is trying to, be more agile. because we're so dependent on government commodities. We're so dependent on the traditional channels that come to us, and we're seeing, you know, a complete re-engineering of retail, for example, where we're not seeing the donations from retail that we were before. And I think the food banking industry for sure is having to re-engineer itself along those lines.
Yeah, well, I think that that theme of agility, flexibility is just core to the resilience. And I remember during the pandemic being contacted by somebody who was trying to put refrigerated trucks outside of food banks just to add to their cold storage capacity at one point. And, you know, I heard some great stories from Imperfect Foods, for instance, right? They kind of take whatever and put it on a list and then people order it. And they had 40,000 United Airline cheese trays that, you know, as soon as everything shut down, they were able to then put those on their site and sell those cheese trays into boxes. And they had popcorn from the movie theaters that had all closed down. So the distributors were sitting there with just like massive amounts of popcorn kernels, and they bagged them up and sold them to people's doors. So I think that flexibility that was built in, and the QR codes you're mentioning, Eric, and the, you know, being able to mix and match, I think finding ways to be flexible, to be agile seems to be just so critical right now. Great. Well, I know I sort of said, like, give me that pre-Ukraine picture, but the reality is the sad and, you know, very concerning reality is that there is this awful war now going on there. And I know that that does have a huge implication on our supply chain and specifically around food. So I wonder, what you all are experiencing and what you're anticipating specifically because of that. Linda, maybe we could start with you.
Yeah, Dana, I'll start. You know, first of all, it's just a tragic situation. And so I just want to acknowledge that up front. And we're talking about sort of the implications for business, but there's certainly a human element here that's much more important. From a business perspective, first of all, gas has been the biggest thing that quickly rippled through, right? So you saw that in, you know, prices. It elevates all the freight costs, all the food costs. We've already got high inflation. But it also, when we're talking about the truck driver shortage, truck drivers, it's a difficult job, right? And for those who are independent, who might be paid by the mile and they eat the gasoline cost, diesel fuel cost, right? That's something that's going to impact them. Why, you know, so they're going to need to be compensated for that, or we might see more fallout, which is really a concern that I do have from this. And then I think the longer term, we haven't seen the longer term yet, right? So you mentioned both in the Ukraine and in Russia. Ukraine is a breadbasket, right? Many people don't know they do a lot of sunflower oil as well. And the farmers right now have a product in warehouses like corn that they can't ship out. Their equipment's getting destroyed. So that's going to be another issue longer term, and they can't get to planting their spring crops. So I think we're just starting to feel it. Now you're seeing it in the futures market. Wheat has hit an all-time high in the futures market, but we're really going to start to see it from availability going forward when those crops don't come in that would normally come in. So I think we're at the beginning of it, really. I hate to, you know, say that, but we've got to think through that and what we can do as we also help the country as well with loss of equipment, loss of things to help them get back to productivity when they safely can.
So a rise in prices likely for a whole number of things, but including wheat, but also anything relying on sunflower oil, corn, and maybe
packaging everything, right? So, you know, a lot of oil-based packaging. It just, you know, I don't know that we can even start to measure the impact, and it will be seen over decades, not over years. It just, you know, there's already, while the trucker shortage was one piece, there is a shortage of new equipment. Microchips, we have back orders that go back well over a year, and we're not alone. So it's, you know, when we talk about reefers, you know, refrigerated trucks, all that, it is beyond that. I mean, it's tractors that get better fuel efficiency. We're running old tractors as companies That's having an impact environmentally, which will have an impact on ultimately food waste. Some folks have to opt out. They can't, you won't have enough capacity. So food, and I think, Dana had talked about the impact that we see in terms of, produce and fresh. That product has to be moved, much quicker. And we're going to see that impact, not just prices, but it's everything related to what's happening in the supply chain. And unfortunately, and it is tragic what's happening in Ukraine, but it is a world crisis. It's unfortunate what they're suffering in terms of humanitarian, but it will affect Europe and the Western, part of the U.S. Just more broadly. So.
And how long do you think this all lasts? Obviously we can't predict the war specifically, but just these trucking challenges and I don't know. I'm just curious, if there's any thinking, is this just the new normal? People need to take control of their own supply chains because everything else is so unpredictable. You need to train your own drivers. Is this the new normal? Or is there some anticipation that this is a temporary thing and someday we'll go back to the lovely supply chains we had, 5-10 years ago?
It's not, it's a new normal. There's good and bad, right? We'll see a shift to new technologies, right? So that's what will happen when you interrupt the diesel market. It allows for disruption in that way, but it will allow for some introduction of new technologies, whether that's, vertical farming. There's changes that we can't anticipate that will come. The world adapts. It will not be easy. There will be impact initially, but then we will find ways, right, to produce more with less. And that's how the world has fallen out over time. But I would believe that we're looking at decades. We're not looking at, years. We're looking at decades.
Got it. Super. Thank you. I want to bring a few questions from the audience in here. We have a few that are focused kind of for you, Dana, on the food banking side of things. So I'm going to sort of pull them all together. And that is, can you speak? So there's a few here. So I'm just going to read them and you can maybe touch on all of them. Can you speak to the technology that you and growers and others are using to manage the supply and demand? And also, have you thought about more food-based technologies, ways to preserve, flash freeze, or process fresh produce that could help preserve some of that produce? And also, what is being done to serve the communities who are miles away from the nearest food bank in a food desert? Is there any shift to getting those people fed? So I'll throw all of those at you, Dana, and also invite folks to add any other questions that they have to the chat.
Yeah, so we've been looking at sort of value-added processing opportunities around produce for some time. We've had some partnerships with the U of A in Tucson and other nonprofits to do some pilot kind of things. We actually have a community kitchen in Tucson that has done some of that. If anybody's on the call, I think you guys are going to provide our contact information that would like to have more conversation directly about this. We're actually really have been seriously trying to move in this direction probably for the last 18 months or so, including looking at doing something in Mexico further up the supply chain around it. And so I think that has got to be a piece of it. Ultimately, there's not one solution to produce waste. There's multiple solutions that includes the whole spectrum from food banks to value-added processing, packaging, things like, and on-farm capacity work too, I think is really important. And so I think that's a big piece that's sitting out there that needs to be taken on. I think that one of the pieces that's sitting out there, and I'll just mention it, that I think all of this is impacting too, is impacting the number of clients that we're serving right now. A lot of folks are living right on the knife edge of being able to make it or not, and it could be the difference of a few extra dollars in their gas tank whether or not they're able to go to work or they're able to go to a food bank. And I think that's a really important question about how are we doing things differently. You know, we serve a 5-county area in southern Arizona, about 80,000 square miles. And a lot of it is rural. A lot of it are, you know, native people that are out on reservations in the middle of nowhere. And so we've developed and became a lot more agile a few years ago to get food equity out, you know, food out equitable to that population. And that's just increasing for us. One of the things, the produce box that we're building has been a real value for that. We're able to go into some small communities out in Cochise County, for example, in southeastern Arizona, take a pallet or two of our packaged produce boxes to a town of maybe 100 people and be able to distribute those, you know, to folks that are out in those rural communities. And I think that that's a big, you know, that's a big piece. We're no different than, you know, commercial entities trying to deliver the last mile. It's a big challenge for food banks, but we're finding that that's super important. We also started during the pandemic delivering commodity boxes to seniors at their homes. A lot of senior folks did not want to come out of their houses. They're challenged anyways with transportation and all of that stuff, but they were, you know, rightly so afraid to come out during the pandemic. And so we started home delivery programs where we're getting those boxes actually to folks' homes, funded by the state with some private grants. And that's something that we're continuing even now that we've done since the pandemic started. So I don't know if I got them all, but
yeah, no,
I
think you got most of them. And anyone interested in helping increase processing capacity down at the border, give Dana a shout.
Thank you.
I do want to call out, we have a shout out here to Sysco for all their amazing donations in the Pacific Northwest. So that must be happening with some of those canceled orders, Eric. And a question maybe for you and Linda that's come up is around trucking and wages, right? Like, is it are wages the reason that we're short on truckers? Like, would increasing wages be the answer? And likely that would have some implication on already high food prices that are going to be even higher because of shortages of wheat and equipment and everything. But just curious, kind of a little bit more about why there is a trucker shortage, if you think, and are wages the main reason or something else?
Yeah, I mean, that's already occurring. In terms of wages, it's just a natural progression, sign-on bonuses, everything. But the reality is a trucker, you know, the industry was not balanced, right? It's 7% women in the US. So having the jobs and roles that are able to attract women. So that's part of our strategy. How do we make the work more palatable? I always tell people, we don't have women because they're too smart based on our current design to do the work. So we're redesigning the work. So if you look at the beverage industry, it's kind of stab and go, right? So I just lifted up with the jack, take it into the account. So those are things that we have resources that are on board, that are engineers that are looking at how do we redesign the work. The other one is an aging demographic, that we have aging baby boomers that are aging out of the population. And then there's other choices, right? So folks are choosing other work that exists, which is we're now competing with that. So, you know, I think some of the technology that makes the vehicle easier to operate, some of the assisted driving technology backing, some of those things will help. But the reality is that it's not the same sort of attractive work that a, you know, computer science job or other jobs may be. So I think it's, you know, how do we fill that vocational niche is part of how we're thinking about it. So, you know, I talk about it at Sysco. Our objective is to never hire another truck driver, but to hire someone who's looking for a career. So that's really how we talk about it. And if you look at it, the organization has a great reputation of promoting those folks from within. So developing programs to do that is how we're thinking about addressing that.
I would echo what Eric said. Certainly wages are moving up. They still need to probably move up more, and will, just based on what's happening with inflation. That's going to have to occur. But we also have to make it a job people want. And so that's looking at hours, it's looking at scheduling. Is it predictable? Is it not predictable? Things like that. What can be done to assist the person who's going to be gone with their family, as far as, you know, any companies that can help with that piece and alleviate some of the burden that they may have, whether it's finding the right childcare, things like that will help. And so it's really addressing the concerns people have at being a trucker that needs to occur. And I think, more and more progress will be made. Maybe Eric mentioned making it easier, getting different people to look at the job as well. I know there's even programs for my sister-in-law. They run something for people who are sort of second chance, right? And they're getting trained to get licenses as well. Just looking at it as a vocation that can be trained in many different places. And kudos to Sysco for starting a training school. Wonderful, because that gives someone a lifelong skill no matter what they decide to do.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think we've hit on some of this already, but kind of with what you were just describing, Eric, and some of what you're saying, Linda, but just looking kind of ahead, it seems like there are some short-term fixes we might need still, and then some longer-term things. So is that, what is not being done right now that we should be thinking about, either short or long-term, to set ourselves up for success? I think we've talked about some of the automation, attracting drivers and training them. Beyond that, are there other things that come to mind?
Yeah, I think that, and we see some of it with the infrastructure bill, is we have to address the infrastructure. I do think that some automation in transportation is possible, but I think we're going to need dedicated lanes for long runs. I don't think that we're going to, in the short term, be able to mix automated trucks with no one behind the wheel. We don't do that with airplanes, right? With individuals that are behind the wheel and not predictable. But I do think if there were dedicated lanes, you could move a lot more freight at a different rate and a different speed. You can platoon. There's a lot of different things we can do. And if we can move it, between major cities, major hubs, it makes that spoke into the outlying areas a lot easier. So I do think those things will develop, which is part of the reason I spend time with college students, folks that are in programs, University of Tennessee and other schools, just to understand how are they thinking, what are they seeing, and how are they thinking about solving, tomorrow's problems? Because I think that's really where the innovation is going to come from.
Great. Well, we are getting close to time here, so I am going to just ask you all to close with one last question, and this is for everyone. What is the most important thing that you want our audience members to take away from this discussion today?
I'll start there. I could have multiple ones. I would say don't focus on pennies at the expense of dollars. So many people did not invest in supply chain risk management, whether it's doing the tabletop drills, looking at what can you do, substitutability of products, having that on the ready. So if you are in a healthcare facility, you do know what you can substitute nutritionally. You have those backup plans. So many people did not spend the time, or if they're before having food loss, do you already know who you would donate to? Having that pre-planned in all your markets. And I say that the time spent with preparation and planning and really looking at your supply chain risk management strategies will pay off way more than just a few cents that you focus on to slice it from $2.10 to $2.08. So.
Super, thank you.
I'll piggyback on what Linda said a little bit. I think that, it's been a hard time the last 2 years for food bankers. The COVID has hit our industry hard. It's been challenging. We've needed to re-engineer ourselves and get more agile. If you're in the food business in a community and you're not partnered with some hunger relief entity somewhere, they're probably sitting out there too overwhelmed to come find you. Reach out on your own and talk to them, because they can absolutely be a solution, whether it's for prepared food or packaged food or fresh produce. They're sitting there in those communities and they can be a solution. And the partnership between the nonprofit hunger relief world and the food producers and manufacturers and transporters, I think is, has a lot more potential than we're actually getting out of it. And don't, I guess the message I would say, if you're sitting out there as a producer or having food that might otherwise have to go to waste and be thrown away, and you're not talking to your local hunger relief entity, go find out who they are and reach out to them, because they'll be thrilled to talk to you and want to partner with you. They may just be too busy to come find you right now, because it's definitely been stressful. But I also just want to say thank you to Linda and Eric. Learned a lot from listening to you guys. And so thank you very much for everything you do.
Enjoyed getting to participate with all of you. So.
Yeah, I would tell you my one thing that I learned, and as part of the reason I joined ReFED and part of the reason I joined Sysco, is waste is not an option. I think the future supply chain waste isn't an option, whether, in every area, food particularly, when you look at it, the world can do better. The world will do better. And if you look at the environmental impacts, the world has to do better.
Well said. Absolutely. Well, thank you. I apologize we didn't get to all the audience questions, some other great ones coming in here, but fantastic conversation. I learned so much from you all. So complicated. We only could scratch the surface. I don't envy all of the complexity that you're having to deal with, but I do appreciate it, and just appreciate all that you are doing to keep everything running and keep that food from going to waste as through it all. So thank you. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And with that, I will turn it back to Jeff for just a moment to close with a few things.
Yes, thank you, Dana, and thanks to our panelists today. Thanks to all of you out there for joining us. We're going to be sending out an email shortly with a link to a recording of today's webinar. Again, if you have any questions or feedback, please reach out to us at insights@refed.org. And please take a moment to answer the questions that are popping up on your screen right now. Your input will help us as we plan out future events. I see lots of responses starting to come in, so thank you with that. Looking good. Thank you, everyone. That's all we've got for today. Thanks again, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much, everyone.